Hey guys, T-Bones here, coming at you with Civil War, turning points of the war. So, Civil War sucked. It was a tough war. It was not going to be the easy war that either side was hoping it would be. Let's see. So, the book skips a few things. I guess it really goes into a lot more of the battles early on. At this point, this time the war is really going back and forth. The South is winning a lot of fights. The North is holding on, but the North is really not doing as well as they thought they were going to do. The book wants to make a big point about how the North has advantages, and it does. In fact, most people thought the North would win pretty easily, but unfortunately the North has a few big disadvantages too. Most of their people had never fired rifles before, whereas in the South they had a lot more folks who were comfortable with rifles and various weapons. In the South, they also, they know what they're doing. They're defending their territory. They're defending their way of life, i.e. slavery. And in the North, a lot of these folks, they don't want slavery per se, but they're not willing to die for it. The feeling just isn't quite the same. Especially because early on, some of them think they're fighting for America, some of them say they're fighting for slavery, some of them say they're fighting for this. But a lot of the people in the North really didn't know. They didn't have the same sort of sense of purpose in the same way that the Southerners did. And, of course, the Southerners had better generals. I hate to admit it, but, the Southerners had far better generals in the beginning. So things go quite poorly. Now, eventually, quite a while into the war, they are going to change how they do things, okay? Abraham Lincoln is going to give purpose to the war. And I think that's a pretty good statement, because early on the Northerners just didn't feel, are they protecting the Union? Are they, what are they doing? A lot of them wanted to fight against slavery, especially when they got to see, when Northerners went down and they were actually able to see Southern plantations. It was a lot like the American soldiers going into Nazi Germany and seeing the concentration camps. When these soldiers saw what it was like for these slaves in these plantations, it was hugely eye-opening. And a lot of them decided that from that day that they wanted to fight against slavery. They wanted to abolish slavery. And that was not the purpose of the war. That was not what Lincoln and the North was trying to do early on. In fact, they very specifically said multiple times they did not want to eliminate slavery for all of America. But eventually, they changed their mind. They realized that going back to the way things were is not going to do anything. It's not going to help. They also realized that if they are their soft approach to the South of trying to appease Southerners by saying that they can keep their slaves was not going to, it wasn't working. The South wanted out. So if it didn't matter about trying to appease the Southerners, then let's just get rid of it. Let's do what we actually want to do and actually get rid of slavery. This was also really important because when the Congress was voting on powers and stuff like that, you only had the North. You didn't have the South there anymore. And so the Republicans in the North controlled both the Senate and the House. Now these were very, very liberal Republicans, okay? These are folks who were considered radical Republicans because they were generally really, really anti-slavery and had a lot of liberal ideas at the time. Now, liberal and conservative have very different thoughts today, right? We think of Republicans as being conservative and liberals being liberal. This time, it's very different, okay, on the political spectrum. In any case, the Republicans at the time really had a different thought. So what happens is 2 years into the war, Lincoln is going to start making waves by starting to free slaves. Now, specifically, what he is going to do to begin with is the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this is not what you think it is. So first off, he doesn't free any slaves in Union-controlled territory. He only frees the slaves in the Confederate South. Okay? Now, that doesn't actually make any sense because the Union doesn't control the South, which is a lot like what some Ukrainians are thinking about doing today, where some Ukrainians are considering changing Russia's name to Muscovy, because that was a earlier name that Russia had gone by, and since Kiev, and the capital of Ukraine, is older than Russia, and if actually had started the Moscow Charter, they believe they have the ability to change the name of Russia. Now, that's all great, but you can't really you can say whatever you want, but you can't actually change something happening in enemy-controlled territory, right? I can say that all loans are forgiven in China. I can say that no Chinese folks owe any more loans. Okay, that doesn't do anything. I don't have the power of China. Heck, I don't even have the power to do that in America. But that's basically what the Emancipation Proclamation was. Is Lincoln was saying that according to the Union, all slaves currently living in the Confederacy were free. Okay. Now, you could tell that to a black person living in Confederacy, and he'd tell you, yeah, that means as much as anything. There's still a white overseer who's whipping me if I don't do work. As far as the slaves living in the Confederacy were concerned, they were always born free. They were always supposed to be free. But until that white overseer is taken care of, they're not going to be free, not truly. The other thing that is important about this is Lincoln didn't just say the Emancipation Proclamation. He said it after a victory. And in fact, we have some stuff saying that they wanted to do it a little earlier, but he did not want it. He wanted it to be the capstone to a Union victory, and not something that would be seen as a distraction from a loss. He wanted to give people a real reason for why they're fighting. And it does. It works. The folks in the North at this point are quite tired of slavery. They have actually seen now firsthand, by being forced to go into the South, what slavery looks like. And they don't like it. They don't like what they see. They didn't grow up seeing a black person being whipped. And if you are seeing that for the first time, oh boy, howdy, is it awful, right? That's not something you would enjoy seeing, and only is it something that you can stand if it's something you grew up with. But the Northerners didn't grow up with it, so when they go to the South fighting and they see the treatment of black folks, they really come away with this idea of we need to free these folks. Emancipation Proclamation is great speech, very powerful. All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people wherever then shall be in rebellion against the United States shall be henceforth forever free. Basically, Lincoln, and the important part here too, forever free. Lincoln is really saying it's an all or nothing now. They are not going to convince the South to stand down and join the Union again if it means that their slaves are forever free, right? There is no walking this statement back. So he said, at this point, the South has foregone any chance of a treaty or a peace deal that allows them to keep their slaves. That point is gone. They have killed enough Union folks. They have caused enough damage that we are not going to reward them by letting them keep their slaves. It wasn't about slavery to begin with, but it's definitely about slavery now as far as the North was concerned. For the South, it was always about slavery. But the North got into the fight specifically to try to just bring the Union back together. Okay. A few more things. I've mentioned this before about Frederick Douglass. He looks like a quite unhappy man here. And that's on purpose. Okay. Frederick Douglass, very brilliant man. He was so focused on ensuring that there was not ever going to be a picture of him smiling. And he did that because all of the pictures of black people that were taken were pictures of happy slaves. That was the caricature, that was the drawings, that was the artwork, that was what they put, is they tried to always have happy slaves. And he didn't like that. He knew no one was actually happy about this. The pictures of happy slaves were lies. They were forced on them. And usually, in fact, they weren't pictures. They were artist representations, because you couldn't actually get the black folks to smile, right? They didn't want to. So he very specifically made sure there would not be a picture of him smiling. He wanted the white folks of the North to see what a real serious black man looked like. And I think he succeeded. I mean, not only is he super duper handsome, but he was a brilliant man, and a very, very good speaker. I would love to meet him. He is really awesome guy. Fighter for freedom, really awesome life. African American soldiers. So here we talk a little bit about the African American regiments in the Civil War. So there's actually both African Americans on the North and the South, which is very odd. The North finally said, okay, we'll allow black folks to serve because they needed the recruitment, and the black folks were more than happy to, right? The North was very wary about this because the North may have been against slavery. That does not mean that there was not racism rampant in the North, okay? Finally, when they allowed them to, you get a massive amount of African Americans who want to serve, okay? But they were not given very good equipment. They were not given very good training. They were used in the worst ways, usually as cannon fodder, as people who were sent out first to die to weaken or soften the enemy position. And yet, the African Americans who served in the Civil War fought with outstanding bravery and commitment. Now, there was a small group who also fought for the South. I don't think it mentions it over here. The small group that fought for the South were basically told, hey, we'll free you if you fight for the South because we're desperate for troops, which is super ironic, but that's how it went. The folks fighting for the South didn't really do much. They were put together, but honestly, the Confederacy never trusted them enough to actually fight because the Confederacy kind of knew that this was not sustainable, that these former slaves in the South did not want the Confederacy to succeed, and so it was not a they did not do any real significant fighting. So they did get formed, but they didn't really see any action as far as I'm aware. Let's see. Conflicts over the draft. Talks about both the service in the North and South. South and North. This was a big deal, okay? When the South claims that they wanted small government, but then they instituted a draft, that was a lot of people felt that was the opposite of what they'd signed up for. it is one thing to sign up for a war when someone else is going to be fighting it. It's another to sign up for a war when you're going to be fighting it, or your son is going to be fighting it. The North, especially, there were a lot of racists in the North, a lot of folks who did not want to go die for some black person. Now, that's, the unfortunate truth is a lot of these folks were not, a lot of the folks in the North were not any less racist than the folks in the South. Remember, there's the Know Nothing Party and such. In fact, there's a huge what is it? Not a rebellion, riot. There's a riot in New York when this happens. And then the big deal, too, is that the North, and in the South, you could pay a fee to avoid being drafted. So if you're rich, you can just pay your way out of being drafted. And you can imagine how upsetting that'd be if you're a poor person and you're like, oh, I have to get drafted and go and fight in this war, and versus a rich person who's like, oh, I just paid some money to not do it. Pretty messed up. Just big, huge riots. Okay. Huge deal. Paying for the war. Okay. This is a big deal. Wars are expensive. And trying to figure out how to do this. The South really gets messed up here. The South did not have a solid strategy for how to pay for these things. It's one of the big things, too, is you had a lot of people who were putting all of their money into the South and turning their money into Confederate bonds. And then when the Confederacy fell, those bonds were worth literally nothing. And so, yeah, it was not huge inflation in the South. Prices for goods increased. Purchasing value of money decreased. Federal government issued war bonds, but most Southerners were too poor to buy them at that point. The Confederacy passed a law requiring all farmers to give 10% of all the crops they raised to the government for use in the war effort. Huge taxes, okay? The Southerners were all about taxes because they were looking for any strategy whatsoever. Impressment, practice that allowed military officers to take anything they thought might be useful to the war, including slaves. So the government was literally taking people's slaves away from them in the South. This is going to be a pretty big deal. If your whole deal was that the South was going to be a place where small government and the freedom to have slaves, and then the big government comes and takes away your slaves and forces you to give up 10% of all your stuff, there's a huge amount of taxes, you're going to be pretty upset. Lot of African Americans did forced labor for the Confederate military. Many of them did rebel and escape to the Union lines. Okay, Southern farms and plantations no longer had the labor necessary to grow. So the Southerners were really struggling here. This was not very sustainable. Wartime prison camps, huge issues here, both in the North and the South. Let's see. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Battle of Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Okay. Here things start to change. The North is starting to actually win. The Confederate troops were tired, poor, didn't have enough stuff, and their morale was breaking. And the North was, starting to pick up steam. Okay. Eventually, the North is going to win. That's where the Gettysburg Address is actually given. Sherman's March. Remember. Sherman on the 10th of November, the March to the Sea. I think it's 10th of November. This is the Anaconda Plan in action. This is all-out war. This is where they, again, we saw back at the beginning that forever free. We know the South isn't. The only way they're joining the Union again is if we force them to, because we win the war. So here they're like, okay, let's stop treating the South like some friends, and let's do everything we can to win. Okay, so here is where they do some pretty ruthless stuff. They start destroying farms and things along the way. Sherman goes ahead and burns down everything that he is, anything that he thinks is helping the Southern economy on his way. He is trashing it. He's like, total war. Okay, this might very well be considered a war crime today, but so would so many of the things the South was doing. So, destroy Southern property, crops, and other supplies. Sherman and his men left Savannah, burning their way northwards to Columbia, South Carolina. From there, they marched into North Carolina. Yeah, total war. It was brutal. It was effective, and it, again, may have been a war crime, but those didn't really exist. Well, I mean, they existed. People did them all the time. Just we didn't have rules against them. Feeling north of the Union was winning. Okay, helped him win an election. Sherman's troops spared the city of Savannah instead of burning it down, because there's a number of theories, but generally he thought it was too beautiful. Someone said he thought it was too beautiful. Possibly just because the leaders surrendered. That's most likely what it was. If you surrender, I won't burn you down. Okay. It also had a huge port that was important. So he did not burn Savannah down because they surrendered. Okay. Grant fights General Lee, and ultimately Lee is going to surrender. Okay. Pretty prolonged fight back and forth. Appomattox. You guys don't have to do this part yet. That's next week. You stop here. All right. That's it for you guys. Well, have a good one.